Every major war in the last 100 years triggered the same financial destruction for ordinary people, not soldiers, not politicians, just regular families trying to survive the economic fallout of a fight they never chose. Read that again. Not soldiers, not politicians, regular families. People who woke up every morning, went to work, paid their bills, tried to save a little, tried to build something, and watched it quietly dismantled by a conflict they had no vote in, no voice in, and no escape from. This is not ancient history. This is a pattern, a repeating, documented, devastating pattern that is played out across every major conflict of the modern era. And right now, with wars spreading across multiple continents, with geopolitical tension at levels not seen in decades, that pattern is activating again. The question isn't whether it will affect you. It already is. Let's go back. Because history doesn't just rhyme. In finance, it practically photocopies itself. World War I, 1914 to 1918. 4 years of industrial-scale destruction. When it ended, the world didn't just pick up where it left off. The economies of Europe were shattered. Governments were drowning in debt. And to pay for that debt, they did what governments always do when they've spent more than they have. They inflated their currencies. Germany is the most extreme example. By 1923, just 5 years after the war ended, hyperinflation in Germany had become so severe that workers were being paid twice a day so they could spend their wages before they lost value by afternoon. People carried money in wheelbarrows. A loaf of bread cost billions of marks. Billions. For bread. That's not an economic statistic. That's a family that saved their entire lives watching their savings become worthless in a matter of months. That's a grandmother's life insurance policy. The things she scrimped and sacrificed for, suddenly unable to buy a single postage stamp. War didn't just destroy buildings. It destroyed lifetimes of financial discipline in a single inflationary wave. Now jump forward. World War II. The United States entered in 1941 to finance the war effort. The ships, the planes, the weapons, the millions of soldiers. The government needed money it didn't have, so it borrowed massively, and it rationed, and it introduced price controls, and it asked ordinary citizens to buy war bonds, essentially lending their savings to the government at interest rates that didn't keep pace with real inflation. The people who bought those bonds were patriots. They were also, financially speaking, giving the government a cheap loan that eroded their purchasing power over time. Nobody told them that part. Vietnam. The 1960s and 70s, the U.S. government tried to fight a war and fund a massive domestic spending program simultaneously, without raising taxes enough to cover either. The result? Deficit spending on a scale the country had never seen. And by the early 1970s, inflation was raging. The dollar was under pressure. Nixon took the U.S. off the gold standard in 1971, a decision driven directly by the financial strain of wartime spending. The ordinary American didn't fully understand what that meant in 1971. They understood it perfectly by 1979, when inflation hit 13.3% and the Federal Reserve had to raise interest rates to nearly 20% to kill it. 20%. Mortgages became unaffordable. Businesses couldn't borrow. Families were squeezed from every direction simultaneously. That's the war tax, not a line item on your tax return, not something declared in a government budget, an invisible, insidious transfer of financial burden from the state to the citizen, delivered through inflation, debt, and currency debasement. Quietly, systematically, every single time. The Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Ukraine, each conflict with its own specific financial fingerprint. Oil shocks, defense spending surges, supply chain disruptions, refugee crises that strain public finances across multiple nations. Different wars, different decades, different enemies. Same result for ordinary people. Higher prices, weaker purchasing power, savings that don't stretch as far as they used to, a future that feels slightly less certain than it did before the first shot was fired. Here's the analogy that captures it perfectly. War is like a flood. The soldiers are in the river, fighting the current, bearing the immediate, visible danger. But ordinary people, they're downstream. They don't see the flood coming. They just notice one day that the water is rising, slowly at first, then faster. And by the time they realize what's happening, their financial ground floor is already underwater. The flood didn't target them, but it found them anyway. And here's what makes this pattern truly sinister. The war tax, the inflation, the debt, the currency destruction is just the surface layer. Underneath it, there is a deeper mechanism, a more deliberate transfer of wealth that governments and financial institutions have used during every major conflict in modern history. A mechanism that most people never learn about, never see, and therefore never protect themselves from. The flood is rising. You felt it in part 1, the pattern, the history. The invisible war tax that reaches into ordinary households across every conflict, every decade, every generation. But here's what nobody tells you at the kitchen table, what no politician mentions in their wartime address, what no mainstream financial channel bothers to explain clearly. The inflation isn't accidental. Read that again. Slowly. The inflation, the rising prices, the shrinking purchasing power, the savings that quietly buy less every year, is not a side effect of war that governments desperately try to prevent. It is the mechanism by which governments pay for war, and understanding that single truth changes everything about how you see your financial life during times of conflict. Here's how it works. When a government decides to go to war or gets pulled into one, the costs are immediate and enormous. Weapons, logistics, personnel, intelligence, technology. The bill arrives instantly. But the political will to raise taxes to cover that bill? That's a much slower, much messier, much more unpopular process. So governments don't fully raise taxes. Not immediately, not honestly. Instead they borrow. They issue bonds. They run deficits. They spend money they don't have against the promise to pay it back later, with interest, using future tax revenue. And when the borrowing isn't enough, when the debt pile grows faster than the economy can absorb it, they do something even more powerful, even more invisible. They print. They instruct their central banks to create new money, to expand the supply of currency in the system, to monetize the debt, which is a technical phrase that means one thing in plain English. They water down your money. Think of it like a pizza. You have 8 slices. That's the money supply. Each slice represents a share of the economy's real value. Now the government prints more money. They add 4 more slices to the pizza. Suddenly, there are 12 slices. But the pizza itself, the real goods, the real services, the real value in the economy, hasn't gotten bigger. It's the same pizza. So each slice is now worth less than it was before. Your savings, your salary, your pension, your carefully accumulated financial slice of the pie just got smaller. Not because you spent it, not because you made bad decisions, but because the government added more slices without telling you. That's inflation. That's currency debasement. And during wartime, it happens faster, more aggressively, and with less transparency than at any other time. History is explicit about this. During World War II, the U.S. money supply expanded dramatically to finance the war effort. Prices rose. The government implemented price controls to hide the inflation, essentially making it illegal for the market to tell the truth about what things actually cost. When the price controls were lifted after the war, inflation exploded immediately. It had been building the entire time, just hidden. During the Vietnam era, the money printing was so sustained and so aggressive that it broke the international monetary system entirely. The Bretton Woods Agreement, which had tied global currencies to the U.S. dollar and the dollar to gold, collapsed under the weight of wartime spending. Nixon closed the gold window in 1971. The last formal anchor connecting paper money to real value was severed. Every dollar in your pocket became, officially and permanently, backed by nothing but confidence. And confidence, as every war demonstrates, is a fragile thing. Here's the part that should genuinely make you angry. This mechanism, this system of financing conflict through inflation and currency debasement, is fundamentally a wealth transfer. It moves purchasing power from the people who hold savings and cash, ordinary working families, retirees, disciplined savers, to the entities that benefit from spending that newly created money first: governments, defense contractors, large financial institutions. By the time the new money filters down to ordinary people, through wages, through services, through the general economy, prices have already risen to reflect it. The benefit has already been captured by those at the top of the spending chain. What reaches the ordinary citizen is just the inflation, the cost without the benefit. The economist John Maynard Keynes described this process with devastating clarity nearly a century ago. He said that through a continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens. Secretly and unobserved, not through a tax you can see on your paycheck, not through a policy you can vote against, through the slow, invisible erosion of what your money can actually buy. And here's the dimension that makes it even more suffocating. War debt outlasts the war by decades, sometimes by generations. The United Kingdom only finished paying off its World War II debt in 2006. 61 years after the war ended. Ordinary British taxpayers were still servicing the financial cost of a conflict that concluded before their parents were born. The United States is still carrying debt from wars fought in the Middle East 2 decades ago. That debt and the interest payments on it crowds out spending on infrastructure, education, healthcare. It is a permanent tax on the future, paid by people who had no say in the decision that created it. You are paying for wars you didn't start, wars you may not have supported, wars that ended before you were old enough to vote. And the next generation will pay for the wars happening right now. That is the true cost of conflict. Not just the lives, not just the infrastructure, the multi-generational financial burden that gets quietly loaded onto the shoulders of ordinary families, while the decisions that created it were made in rooms they were never invited into. Now you know how the machine works. You can see it clearly. The borrowing, the printing, the inflation, the wealth transfer, the debt that outlasts the conflict by half a century. But here's the question that actually matters. Knowing how the machine works doesn't protect you from it. Understanding the mechanism doesn't automatically preserve your wealth. Seeing the flood doesn't stop the water from rising. So what do you actually do? Because throughout history, in every conflict, in every inflationary period, in every moment of geopolitical and financial chaos, there were people who didn't just survive the machine. They figured out how to step outside of it. They figured out how to step outside of it. Not the politicians, not the generals, not the people with the most money or the most power or the most connections. Ordinary people with ordinary incomes who simply understood something that the majority didn't, that in every financial storm, no matter how violent, no matter how widespread, no matter how long it lasts, the storm doesn't destroy everything equally. It destroys the unprepared. It redistributes from the passive to the intentional, from the uninformed to the aware. And awareness, right now, in this moment, is your single most powerful financial weapon. So let's talk about what the prepared actually did, what they always do, what you can start doing right now, regardless of your income, regardless of your current portfolio, regardless of how far behind you feel. Because this isn't about being rich. It's about being deliberate. The first thing they did, they stopped holding their wealth exclusively in cash. Remember the pizza analogy. When governments print money, cash loses value. It's not dramatic. It's not sudden. It's quiet and consistent and merciless. The people who survived wartime inflation historically were not the ones with the most cash in the bank. They were the ones who converted cash into things that held real value. Assets that inflation couldn't silently devour. Gold, silver, real estate, commodities. Productive land, businesses with pricing power, meaning businesses that could raise their prices as inflation rose, protecting their real value. These assets don't just survive inflation. During periods of currency debasement, they often appreciate. Because as the value of paper money falls, the price of real things rises to compensate. Gold is the clearest historical example. During every major inflationary period tied to wartime spending, WW1 aftermath, World War II, the Vietnam era, the 2008 financial crisis, the post-COVID inflation surge, gold has consistently preserved purchasing power when paper currency couldn't. It's not magic, it's just scarcity. You can print dollars. You cannot print gold. The prepared understood this. They moved a portion of their wealth, not all of it, a strategic portion, into assets the government couldn't devalue with a printing press. The second thing they did, they invested in essential, conflict-resistant businesses. War disrupts many industries, but it accelerates others. Energy, defense, agriculture, healthcare, infrastructure. These are not luxuries. They are necessities, and necessities don't stop being needed because the geopolitical environment is unstable. In many cases, they become more needed. The families that built positions in energy companies during wartime oil shocks didn't suffer from rising fuel prices. They were partially insulated, because as the price of oil rose, so did the value of their energy holdings. The cost and the asset moved in the same direction. One offset the other. This is not speculation. This is strategic alignment, positioning your financial interests to run parallel to the forces that are harming everyone else. It doesn't eliminate risk. Nothing eliminates risk, but it transforms you from a pure victim of the economic forces of war into someone with partial protection against them. The third thing they did, they aggressively eliminated financial vulnerability. War creates economic uncertainty, and economic uncertainty is most dangerous to people who are already financially fragile. People with high debt loads, people with no emergency reserves, people living paycheck to paycheck with no buffer between their income and their obligations. When inflation spikes and interest rates rise, as they always do in wartime and post-wartime environments, debt becomes brutally expensive. The family carrying significant variable rate debt in an inflationary environment isn't just paying for their purchases. They're paying for the government's war on top of it, to interest rates that rise to combat the very inflation the government created. The prepared reduced their debt before the pressure arrived. They built cash reserves, not as a permanent home for their wealth, but as a buffer, a shock absorber, the financial equivalent of a solid foundation before the earthquake hits. Because here's the truth about financial resilience during wartime. It's not about brilliant investment picks. It's about not being forced to make desperate decisions. The person with no emergency fund gets hit with an unexpected expense during an economic downturn, and they sell their investments at exactly the wrong moment just to cover it. The person with 6 months of reserves, they don't have to sell anything. They ride it out. They wait. They let the recovery come to them. Resilience creates options, and options, the freedom to choose your timing, your moves, your response, are the most valuable financial asset you can own during a crisis. The fourth thing, and this is the one most people dismiss because it sounds too simple, they kept learning. The single most consistent characteristic of people who built and preserved wealth across periods of war and financial chaos wasn't their investment strategy. It wasn't their income level. It wasn't luck or timing or connections. It was financial literacy, the understanding of how money works, how governments behave under financial pressure, how inflation operates, how markets respond to fear and uncertainty, how to read the signals that most people miss because they were never taught to look for them. You are building that literacy right now, in this moment. By understanding the pattern, by seeing the mechanism, by refusing to be the person downstream who only notices the flood when the water is already at their ankles. That matters more than any single investment decision you will ever make, because here's the final truth about war and your finances. You cannot stop the war. You cannot control the governments that finance it through inflation. You cannot opt out of the economic system that transmits its costs to ordinary households across the globe. But you are not powerless. You have something that the majority of people walking through this moment do not have: awareness, understanding, the ability to see the machine for what it is and make deliberate, informed decisions in response to it. The flood is real. The water is rising. It has always risen during times like these, and it will rise again the next time the world decides that violence is the answer. But there is a difference between the person caught in the flood and the person who saw it coming, moved to higher ground, and built something solid before the water arrived. One is a victim of history. The other is a student of it. And students of history, the ones who truly learn its lessons, don't just survive the storm. They emerge from it stronger than when it began.